I am Samantha Monroe, 21 years old, born and raised in Charleston, South Carolina, and a soldier who learned far too early that family can cut deeper than any enemy bullet. The day I received my Purple Heart at Fort Bragg, North Carolina, was supposed to be the proudest moment of my life. Instead, it became the day my stepmother smashed a chair across my arm because she could not stand to see me honored. The crack of bone and the gasp from the audience silenced the hall more effectively than any military order ever could. One moment I was steady on my feet, the fabric of my dress uniform pressed crisp against my shoulders, carrying a veteran who had struggled to rise from his seat. The next moment, my body lurched sideways, pain flaring up my arm, my vision spotting as I hit the stage floor. I had no idea then that the man I had carried was not just another veteran, but a 3-star General Robert Hayes, who would turn the entire event into something no one in that room would ever forget. I remember every detail of that morning. The autumn air was cool, and Fort Bragg was alive with the murmur of families, officers, and soldiers all gathered for a ceremony meant to honor sacrifice. Flags lined the perimeter of the field, their colors sharp against the Carolina sky. The brass band rehearsed softly their notes, drifting like a promise of solemn dignity. For once, I thought maybe my family would sit in quiet pride. They had never understood why I enlisted straight out of high school, never cared that I carried their financial burdens with my military pay, never admitted that the structure and loyalty I found in the Army was the only stability I had ever known. But perhaps I told myself as I walked across the polished floor of the assembly hall, this was the day they might finally respect me. I was wrong. From the corner of my eye, I saw my father Daniel Monroe, slouched in the third row, arms crossed, jaw tight. My stepmother Linda sat rigid next to him, her lips pressed into a line that had nothing to do with pride. My half-brother Kyle smirked as if he were watching a comedy show, whispering something that made my father shake his head in disgust. The sight carved through me sharper than the shrapnel that had nearly ended my life overseas. But I kept walking chin-lifted steps firm. A soldier knows how to keep formation even when her heart is breaking. Then the veteran in the front row tried to rise. He was older, his medals gleaming faintly on a faded suit jacket, his legs unsteady. Without thinking, I bent, slipped his arm across my shoulder, and helped him toward the stage. His weight was heavy, but not unbearable, the kind of burden soldiers carry without complaint. Each step drew a few murmurs of admiration from the officers seated nearby, and for a flicker of a second, I felt that warmth of shared respect. But behind me, I heard Linda hiss through clenched teeth, loud enough for others to notice, accusing me of showing off. By the time we reached the stairs, her chair scraped violently against the floor. I turned my head just as she lifted it with both hands, fury twisting her face. The impact landed before I could fully react. A blunt explosion of pain shot through my arm, a sickening crack echoing in my ears. My knees buckled, and the veteran gasped, nearly tumbling with me until strong hands steadied us both. The hall fell into stunned silence, punctuated by scattered shouts. I clutched my arm, tears stinging my eyes, not from weakness, but from the sheer shock that my own stepmother had chosen this moment of all moments to humiliate me. Every childhood memory of slammed doors, shouted insults, and bruises hidden under sleeves converged into that instant. The betrayal felt complete, public, undeniable. My gaze swept the audience. Uniformed officers leaned forward, disbelief etched across their faces. Families stared wide-eyed, some whispering prayers, others frozen with mouths open. My father did not move. Kyle looked almost entertained, and Linda, her chest heaving, shouted for everyone to see that I was nothing more than a fraud seeking attention. That accusation, louder than the crash of wood against bone, burned into me. I wanted to scream that I had bled for this country, that the scars under my uniform were proof enough, but the pain in my arm silenced me. The veteran at my side, however, did not let me fall. He held me steady, his grip unyielding, his expression shifting from surprise to fury. He guided me upright and looked directly at the officers near the podium. A subtle nod passed the kind of gesture that carried weight only those in command understood. In that moment, I sensed power radiating from him, though I still did not know who he truly was. The military police began to move down the aisle, their steps purposeful. The audience buzzed in confusion, some rising from their seats. And in the midst of it all, the veteran cleared his throat, his voice cutting through the chaos like steel. Later, I would replay that moment countless times, the seconds when silence collapsed under the weight of revelation. But right then, with my arm throbbing and my dignity shredded in front of hundreds, I had only one thought echoing through my mind. Family had finally exposed themselves not as supporters, but as saboteurs. Before I tell you what happened next, let me ask you this. Have you ever been ridiculed or struck down by the very people who should have stood by you during your proudest moment? If you have, you know the hollow ache that lingers. Share your story at the comments. You are not alone. Charleston, South Carolina was my hometown, but to me it always felt like a battlefield long before I ever deployed overseas. The pastel houses, the cobblestone streets, the tourists snapping photographs of horse-drawn carriages, none of that matched the life I lived behind closed doors. In our modest two-story home near the Ashley River, silence was never peaceful. It was a warning. My father, Daniel Monroe, could turn any quiet dinner into a storm if the whiskey bottle had been emptied too quickly. His voice carried the sharpness of someone always dissatisfied, always convinced that others had failed him. When he looked at me, his daughter who had enlisted in the Army at 18, I saw not pride but resentment, as if my success had robbed him of an excuse for his own failures. Linda Monroe. My stepmother was a different kind of storm. She did not explode in shouts as often as my father, but her control came in the form of icy commands and a gaze that could slice. She had married my father when I was 10, and from the very beginning she made it clear that her loyalty was to herself. She decided what we ate, how the bills were paid, and even what I should study, though I ignored her demands the day I signed my enlistment papers. For Linda, my choice to serve was not honorable. It was an insult, a declaration that I would rather die in a desert halfway around the world than bend to her rules at home. My half-brother Kyle Monroe learned quickly how to thrive under her shadow. At 23, he had mastered the art of manipulation, offering Linda just enough obedience to earn her favor and mocking me whenever her eyes were turned away. To him, I was not a soldier. I was a target for jokes a soldier Barbie, as he liked to sneer, turning my dedication into a punchline. He never kept a steady job, but somehow there was always money for his car insurance for nights out for gadgets. That money often came from me. It had started small. My father would mention overdue bills when I called home from basic training. Then Linda would hint that Kyle's tuition was late. Eventually, it became expected that every deployment check and every allowance would find its way back to Charleston. I told myself that family came first, that this was my duty off the battlefield. But deep down, I knew the truth. They were draining me dry, and the moment I stopped providing, I would be cut off. Still, I clung to the hope that maybe one day they would see me differently. Maybe one day they would be proud. The Purple Heart ceremony seemed like that day until the chair came crashing down. The story of my family was not only written in harsh words and slammed doors, but also in the small humiliations that piled up year after year until they formed a mountain I could never climb. When I was 12, I made the honor roll at school. I had studied late into the night under the weak glow of a desk lamp, determined to prove myself. The next morning, I placed the certificate on the kitchen table with the pride of a child desperate for recognition. My father glanced at it once, muttered that grades would not put food on the table, and went back to the sports section of the newspaper. Linda did not even look up from her coffee. Kyle snatched the paper, crumpled it, and laughed. That moment taught me that no matter what I accomplished, it would never be enough. The pattern continued through high school. I worked summer jobs at a hardware store and a diner to save money for college, but every dollar seemed to vanish into the bottomless pit of family needs. My father's construction jobs were inconsistent, sometimes plentiful, sometimes non-existent, always dependent on whether his temper had burned bridges. Linda cleaned houses across town, returning home with cracked hands and a bitter scowl, reminding us all how much she sacrificed, though her wages rarely went toward bills. Kyle drifted from one scheme to another, quick to borrow money and slow to pay it back. I became the dependable one. If the electricity bill was overdue, I covered it. If Kyle's car needed repairs, I loaned the money. When Linda wanted new furniture, she found ways to guilt me into paying. They said it was because I was responsible, but I knew it was because I was easy to manipulate. Responsibility was the mask they put on exploitation. The truth is, I did not join the Army only out of patriotism. Yes, I wanted to serve my country to earn discipline and honor, but I also wanted distance. The day I signed my enlistment papers, I felt something I had never felt before: freedom. My father accused me of running away. Linda said I was abandoning them. Kyle laughed and called me a fool. But for once, I had chosen a path that was mine alone. Even then, I could not cut ties completely. Every deployment brought new requests. Kyle needed help with tuition. Linda insisted the roof was leaking. My father hinted that the truck was about to give out. The more they asked, the more I gave, thinking it might earn their respect. But all it earned me was silence when I called home to share good news. When I completed boot camp, Linda said only that I had chosen a dangerous life. When I earned my first commendation, my father said medals were meaningless trinkets. Each dismissal hardened something inside me, though not enough to sever the bond. That would take a chair crashing against my arm at Fort Bragg. Charleston had always been a city of contrasts for me. Tourists saw the cobblestone streets, the pastel houses, and the scent of salt drifting in from the harbor. I saw nights of shouting behind closed doors, holes punched in drywall, and a stepmother whose voice could cut sharper than any blade. The neighborhood kids envied me because I lived near the beach. They never saw Linda pressing my face against the mirror, hissing that I would never be good enough, or my father stumbling in from a bar, reeking of whiskey, slurring accusations that I had made his life harder just by existing. When I was 16, Kyle got into a fight outside a bar. He had been drinking with friends, flashing cash he did not earn, and someone knocked him to the pavement. He came home with a swollen jaw and bleeding knuckles. Linda screamed at me, demanding why I had not been there to protect him. I reminded her I had been at work pulling a double shift to pay for my textbooks. She slapped me across the face so hard my ear rang for days. My father stood in the corner, shaking his head, muttering that I should have done more for family. It was always my fault, their failures, their bad choices, their lack of discipline, somehow all tied back to me not being enough. The Army became my escape hatch. I had watched recruits in uniform marching down Broad Street once during a parade, their heads held high, their steps perfectly aligned. That image burned into me, a vision of order and respect I craved. I enlisted right after high school, ignoring Linda's warnings that I would come back broken and my father's sneer that I was throwing away my youth. Kyle laughed, calling me Soldier Barbie, convinced I would never survive boot camp. Their doubt fueled me more than their support ever could. Boot camp at Fort Jackson was grueling, but I thrived. The early mornings, the endless drills, the push until your body shook, it all made sense to me. The instructors yelled, but behind the shouting was purpose. Unlike Linda's cruelty, this discipline had direction. When I graduated, standing in formation with sweat still clinging to my back, I felt something I had never felt at home. Pride, that was mine, and mine alone. Yet, even then, when I called home to share the news, Linda asked if I could send money for Kyle's overdue rent. The cycle never ended. By the time I was deployed, I had accepted that they would never change. Still, I carried their voices inside me, as if each step in desert sand had echoes of Charleston waves crashing on the shore. I wanted to believe service would finally prove my worth, but deep down, I knew their approval was a prize I would never win. The deployment to Afghanistan hardened me in ways my family could never understand. The desert air was brutal, the missions relentless, but within my unit there was loyalty that I had never known at home. We watched each other's backs, shared rations when supply lines faltered, and carried the weight of fear together. That kind of brotherhood and sisterhood was foreign to me. At night, under the hum of generators and the distant echo of artillery, I sometimes thought about Charleston. I wondered if Linda was pacing the kitchen, if my father was at a bar stool, if Kyle was asleep in someone else's bed while unpaid bills piled up on the counter. I told myself they might finally appreciate me now that I was half a world away risking my life. But when I called home, the pattern returned unchanged. Linda's first words were not, "Are you safe?" but "We are short on the mortgage." My father asked about my life insurance policy. Kyle wanted money for classes he would never attend. I sent it, of course. Every wire transfer was another attempt at buying approval, another hope that maybe this time gratitude would follow. It never did. When the ambush happened near Kandahar, when 3 in my squad did not make it back, I thought surely that news would shake something inside them. Instead, when I finally recovered enough to call home, Linda sighed into the phone. "You chose that life, Samantha. Do not act surprised at the consequences. My father said only that soldiers die all the time. It is nothing new." Kyle laughed in the background, calling me unlucky. Their indifference wounded deeper than the shrapnel still lodged in my shoulder. Coming back stateside, I carried more than scars. I carried the realization that family could drain you even when you had nothing left to give. Yet I still invited them to my Purple Heart ceremony at Fort Bragg. A part of me, naive and desperate, hoped the sight of me in uniform receiving that honor would change the script at last. I pictured my father clapping Linda, shedding a tear Kyle forced into silence by the respect of others. I imagined pride replacing scorn. That fantasy was the only thing that kept me steady during months of medical reviews and paperwork. But in the days leading up to the ceremony, reality bled back in. Linda reminded me over the phone that they were attending only because appearances mattered in Charleston society. My father complained about gas money. Kyle joked that medals were just shiny excuses for failing to stay unharmed. Their words clung to me like shadows even as I rehearsed standing straight in dress uniform, even as I tried to picture applause instead of silence. The background of my life was set. My family was not coming to honor me. They were coming to endure me, and I did not yet know how far their disdain would go. The morning of the ceremony at Fort Bragg felt heavier than any deployment pack I had ever carried. The base was alive with the rhythm of tradition. Rows of folding chairs stretched across the parade ground, flags stirred in the Carolina breeze, and the distant sound of a brass band tuning instruments drifted on the air. Soldiers moved with quiet precision, their uniforms crisp boots, polished faces solemn. This was sacred ground, a place where sacrifice was honored, where pain was given shape through medals pinned to chests. I had woken before dawn, staring at my reflection in the barracks mirror as I adjusted my uniform again and again. Every crease had to be perfect, every ribbon aligned. My hands shook slightly, not from nerves about the medal itself, but from the knowledge of who would be sitting in the third row. My family. The same people who had dismissed every accomplishment, who had mocked every step of my service, were about to witness a moment they could not belittle. At least that was the hope I clung to. As I approached the ceremony grounds, the hum of conversation filled the air. Families sat together whispering with a mix of pride and anxiety, children fidgeting in their Sunday clothes. I caught glimpses of mothers holding tissues, fathers straightening ties, siblings craning their necks to spot their soldier. When my eyes found the Monroe section, the air seemed to tighten in my lungs. There was Linda in her pearl-studded navy dress posture, stiff eyes, sharp. My father sat beside her arms, crossed expression carved from stone. Kyle leaned back with that familiar smirk, scrolling his phone until Linda slapped it from his hand. They looked out of place not because of how they dressed, but because of the cold detachment radiating from their row while everyone else beamed with pride. I tried to focus on the officers seated in front. Their uniforms gleamed under the sun, their faces set with respect. These were people who understood the cost of what we had endured, who valued the meaning of a Purple Heart. I clung to that sense of belonging as if it were armor against the glares of my own blood. The program began with the sound of the band, a slow, reverent march that silenced the crowd. An officer stepped to the podium, his voice steady as he spoke about duty sacrifice and the invisible scars carried by those who served. I listened, but my gaze kept drifting back to the third row. Linda whispered something to my father, and he shook his head. Kyle stifled a laugh. Their disdain seeped through the respectful hush, a crack in the solemnity that only I seemed to notice. It made my stomach twist, but I forced my shoulders back chin high. I had survived worse than their mockery. What I did not know was how far they would go before the day was over. As the opening remarks continued, I shifted my weight from one foot to the other, trying to steady my breathing. The summer sun bore down, pressing heat into the stiff fabric of my uniform. Sweat gathered at the back of my neck, but I held my posture. It was not the weather that made me uneasy. It was the quiet ticking of time as the moment inched closer when my name would be called and I would have to walk past the third row. I thought back to the phone call with Linda just 3 nights earlier. I had told her the schedule for the ceremony, hoping for once to hear a note of pride. Instead, she sighed and said, "We're coming because people will ask if we don't. Do not mistake our presence for approval." Her words had cut deep, though I pretended otherwise. I had trained myself to absorb cruelty without showing the wound the way a soldier learns to carry pain silently. But the sting returned now, echoing louder with each tick of the clock. I looked around at other families. A mother clutched her son's hand so tightly her knuckles whitened. A young wife dabbed her eyes, whispering something to the baby balanced on her lap. Fathers leaned forward in anticipation, eager for their children's names to be called. Pride radiated from them like sunlight. I envied them in ways I could not admit, even to myself. My eyes drifted back to my family. Linda adjusted her necklace with exaggerated boredom, as if the ceremony were an inconvenience. My father checked his watch, lips pursed in irritation. Kyle slouched further down his long legs, stretched rudely into the aisle. Their presence felt like a stone lodged in my chest. I wanted to ignore them, but their disdain pulled at me like a magnet. Then my gaze shifted to the veterans seated nearby, some in wheelchairs, others leaning on canes, medals gleaming across chests that had endured more than most could imagine. Their faces carried the weight of years of battles survived, of comrades lost. When one of them caught my eye, he gave a small nod. Simple, steady, full of respect. That nod grounded me. Whatever my family thought, I was not here for them. I was here for the ones who never came home. The officer at the podium finished his introduction, and the brass band's notes softened into silence. The general, seated near the front, adjusted his papers. I knew my turn was coming. My pulse quickened, my palms damp despite the gloves. In the hush that followed, I heard Kyle's voice carry farther than he intended. "This is going to be a joke," he muttered, just loud enough for a few heads to turn. Linda hissed at him to be quiet, but her smirk betrayed agreement. My throat tightened. This was the build-up to a moment I had dreamed of for years, yet the people meant to support me were preparing to ruin it. The program moved forward with the steady rhythm of tradition. Names were called, soldiers stepped onto the stage, medals pinned, applause rising and falling like waves. I clapped for each one, proud of them, though my mind never strayed far from the weight pressing on my chest. Soon it would be my name. Soon I would have to walk past the third row and stand before the nation in uniform, while the people who had broken me sat close enough to spit their scorn. When the announcer called another recipient, an older veteran beside me struggled to rise from his chair. His cane slipped, his legs trembled, and instinct propelled me forward before thought had a chance to intervene. I reached his side, slipping my arm under his, steadying his weight against my shoulder. His breath came ragged, but he nodded with quiet gratitude. Together, we moved toward the stage, step by step, his dignity intact, because I refused to let him falter in front of the crowd. The murmurs from the audience swelled as they watched. I thought perhaps they saw only a young soldier honoring an elder. What I did not realize was how dangerous that small act of decency would become once filtered through Linda's eyes. From the third row, I caught the sharp turn of her head, the way her mouth twisted into a sneer. To her, nothing I did could be genuine. It was all performance, all a desperate attempt to prove I was better than the family that had rejected me. I recognized the storm brewing in her glare, but I had no time to prepare for it. The veteran's weight pressed heavily against me, but I held him steady as we reached the steps. Applause rippled through the crowd, a moment of warmth that pierced the tension. For a fleeting instant, I allowed myself to believe the day might hold grace after all. My heart lifted, pride flickering like a fragile flame. But just as quickly, a voice hissed through the silence, Linda's voice. "Stop showing off!" The words were sharp enough to draw blood. My body froze, but I forced myself to keep moving, guiding the veteran toward the podium. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw Kyle chuckle, my father's jaw clench. Linda's hand gripped the back of her chair. Something inside her was coiling tighter, ready to strike. The air grew brittle, with the kind of tension soldiers recognize before a fight begins. My pulse thundered in my ears. I had carried men bleeding through desert sand. I had dragged comrades out of burning vehicles. But nothing felt as precarious as that moment under the Carolina sun, with my stepmother's fury rising like a storm about to break. The moment felt suspended in time, as though the entire parade ground held its breath. I was still supporting the veteran up the steps, his frail body leaning against me when the scrape of metal legs against pavement cut through the silence. It was the sound of a folding chair being dragged backward. I turned my head slightly enough to see Linda rising from her seat, her face flushed crimson eyes blazing with fury I knew too well. My stomach dropped, but my hands tightened around the veteran to keep him steady. Enough, she spat her voice loud enough to ripple through the rows. Heads turned, conversations hushed. The applause from the previous soldiers' award ceremony died like a candle snuffed out. "Stop pretending you're some kind of hero." The words sliced through me sharper than the desert wind ever had. I wanted to ignore her to focus on the man beside me, but then it happened in a flash. Linda's hands gripped the back of the chair, her movements jerky and violent. With a sudden swing, she lifted it high over her head. For a heartbeat, the sunlight glinted off the metal frame, a grotesque parody of a salute. Then she brought it crashing down toward me. The impact exploded against my arm before I could react. A sharp crack tore through bone pain, radiating up into my shoulder, like fire igniting under my skin. I staggered the veteran, nearly slipping from my grasp. Gasps erupted from the audience, a chorus of disbelief, horror, and shock. Some rose to their feet, others clutched their mouths. The sound of fabric rustling filled the silence, as though the entire crowd had inhaled at once and forgotten to exhale. The world narrowed into fragments, the burning in my arm, the weight of the veteran pulling me down. Linda's distorted face twisted with triumph. My knees buckled and I fell against the podium, the veteran clutching my shoulder with trembling hands to steady himself. My breath came ragged shallow, every inhale stabbing against broken bone. From somewhere behind me came the commanding voice of an officer. Security boots pounded against the pavement as two MPs surged forward. The veteran raised his cane as if to shield me, his frail body shaking with indignation. "What's wrong with you?" he demanded. His voice cracked but strong enough to reach the rows. But Linda was not finished. She dropped the chair with a clang, its metal frame bouncing against the ground, and pointed at me with shaking hands. "She's not brave. She's a liar. She's always been a fraud." Her accusations hung heavy in the humid Carolina air. The silence that followed was suffocating. My body screamed with pain, but it was the humiliation that pierced deeper. In front of soldiers, officers, and families, I had been reduced not to a decorated warrior, but to a child attacked by her own stepmother. The ache in my arm was nothing compared to the ache in my chest as the crowd stared, waiting to see what would happen next. Before I could gather myself from the floor, a hand steadied my good shoulder. Strong, firm, deliberate. I looked up through blurred vision and saw the face of the man I had just carried onto the stage. The veteran I thought I had simply helped was standing taller now, his posture shedding years, his voice carrying the authority of command. Enough, he thundered, and the word echoed across the ceremony grounds with such force that silence snapped back into place like a slammed door. Gasps rippled through the crowd as whispers darted from row to row. Recognition spread. This was not just any veteran. This was Lieutenant General Robert Hayes, a 3-star general whose career spanned decades, whose reputation in Arlington and beyond was synonymous with honor. His presence transformed the stage instantly. General Hayes slipped an arm around me, bracing my weight, as if to shield me from both the pain and the humiliation. His gaze locked onto Linda, whose fury faltered under the weight of his authority. This soldier, he said, his voice sharp and resonant, did not carry me out of weakness. She carried me out of strength. She carried me because I needed her. Murmurs rose from the audience. Linda's eyes widened as though she finally grasped who stood before her. My father's arms, once folded in defiance, slackened at his sides. Kyle leaned forward, pale, no smirk on his lips now. General Hayes adjusted his stance, ensuring I was steady, then addressed the crowd. What you witnessed here was not showmanship. It was loyalty. It was courage, and it was desecrated by violence from her own blood. He gestured toward the crumpled chair on the ground. No enemy abroad has struck her as she was struck today by the very family meant to honor her. The words sent a shiver through me. My arm throbbed with each pulse of my heart, but the ache in my chest shifted from humiliation to something else, vindication. Two military police officers reached Linda's row. She tried to step back, but General Hayes's voice cut her escape. "Stay where you are." The authority in his tone brooked no defiance. The MPs flanked her, their presence a wall she could not breach. The general bent, slightly lowering his voice for only me to hear. "You are not alone, Sergeant. Not anymore." His words were simple, but in that moment they carried more weight than any medal. The crowd began to murmur again, but this time the sound carried not pity, not disbelief, but anger on my behalf. Faces turned toward Linda and my father, eyes sharp, expressions condemning. Strangers who had never met me were rising to my defense, led by the presence of a general who had chosen to stand at my side. What had begun as an attack meant to break me had shifted into something else entirely. The public humiliation was no longer mine. It belonged to them. The parade ground had gone silent except for the faint rustle of flags in the Carolina breeze. General Hayes remained steady beside me, his hand still firm on my shoulder, his eyes locked on the crowd with the kind of authority that silenced even the boldest heckler. He did not rush, did not stumble. When he spoke again, his voice carried the weight of decades in uniform, a voice accustomed to being obeyed. This soldier, he repeated his tone even sharper now, wasn't carrying just anyone. She carried me. The words dropped like stones into still water, sending ripples of shock through the audience. Gasps escaped, whispers raced across rows. Officers stiffened in their chairs. Families leaned forward wide-eyed. Linda's face drained of color, her fingers clenching the hem of her dress. My father's jaw slackened. Kyle blinked like he could not process what he was hearing. General Hayes straightened to his full height, commanding the space as if the entire installation bent to his will. "What happened here today is shameful," he said, "but it is more than an outburst. It is the culmination of something far darker, something I can no longer allow to remain hidden." He reached into the inside pocket of his uniform jacket and withdrew a manila folder. The sight of it sent a chill through me. This was not part of any Purple Heart script. This was something else, something heavier. 18 months ago, Hayes continued lifting the folder so all could see a counterintelligence investigation began into compromised information leaking out of Fort Bragg. Information about patrol routes, training schedules, deployment rumors. At first, the source was unclear, but the trail did not lead overseas. It led right here, to Charleston, to the Monroe family. The air shattered with murmurs. Heads swiveled toward my family's row. Linda pressed a trembling hand to her chest. My father muttered under his breath, his voice too low to hear, but his expression frantic. Kyle shifted as though he might rise, then froze under the gaze of the MP's standing watch. My own pulse roared in my ears. I thought I had misheard. Betrayal was a word I had tasted before in their cruelty, but this was something else. This was treason. Hayes opened the folder and scanned the pages, his tone precise, clinical. Financial records, phone logs, email transcripts, all showing consistent communication with individuals later identified as foreign operatives. Payments funneled through local accounts in Charleston. Every transfer aligned with requests for information about unit movements, requests that coincided directly with ambushes overseas. The audience gasped again. My knees wavered, but Hayes's grip on my shoulder steadied me. His gaze returned to my stepmother, then my father, then Kyle. "You did not just mock this soldier's service. You profited from endangering it." General Hayes held the folder in one hand, his other still bracing my shoulder. His voice carried the weight of undeniable authority, each word deliberate, precise, impossible to misinterpret. "Let me be clear. This is not suspicion. This is documented fact." He lifted a page for the audience to see. On January 12th of last year, a payment of $10,000 was deposited into an account belonging to Daniel Monroe. That very same week, an enemy unit staged an ambush outside Kandahar, an ambush that left 3 soldiers dead and this young woman scarred for life. His eyes bored into my father. "That blood traces directly to your greed." A wave of gasps rippled through the crowd. My father shook his head violently, his lips moving soundlessly until words broke free. We didn't know. They said it was research, just surveys, nothing harmful. His voice cracked like old timber under strain. General Hayes did not soften. He turned another page. On March 3rd, a second transfer this time into an account in Linda Monroe's name. $15,000. The request connected to that payment was for training schedules at Fort Bragg, including upcoming field exercises. Within days, hostile actors probed those very schedules. His gaze swept to Linda. Do not feign ignorance, Mrs. Monroe. You signed the withdrawal slips yourself. Linda's face blanched, her fingers clutching her pearls until the strand pressed deep into her skin. She stammered, They told us it was government approved, that it was for understanding the strain on families. We thought we were helping. The general's voice cut her off like a blade. Helping? By endangering American soldiers, by profiting from information you never had the right to share. His tone was sharp, almost trembling with controlled anger. Ignorance is not an excuse when the consequence is death. Then his gaze shifted to Kyle. The smirk that had so often twisted my brother's mouth was gone, replaced by wide eyes and a face drained of color. Hayes pulled another document from the folder. April 14th, a down payment on a Charleston condo purchased under Kyle Monroe's name. The source transfers routed from the same accounts linked to foreign handlers. The justification providing background details about soldiers' living arrangements and family structures. He let the page fall back into the folder. That is not harmless gossip. That is intelligence. The silence that followed was suffocating. Rows of soldiers stared, their faces hardened with disgust. Some shook their heads, others whispered in disbelief. I stood frozen, my broken arm, screaming, my chest tightening with each revelation. I had long known my family's cruelty, but betrayal at this level. Betrayal written in bank statements and emails, it was almost too much to grasp. General Hayes did not give them space to speak again. His eyes swept the crowd before returning to my family. You chose money over loyalty. You chose betrayal over blood. And today, in front of those who serve with honor, that choice will no longer remain hidden. The silence after General Hayes's words was unlike anything I had ever felt. It was not the quiet of respect, nor the hush of ceremony. It was the silence of disbelief, of collective outrage, settling over a crowd that could not yet process what they had just heard. Then came the ripple. Gasps, whispers, a low murmur that spread across the rows like a wave breaking against a shore. I lifted my eyes from the stage and scanned the faces before me. A mother in the front row clutched her son's hand, shaking her head with tears in her eyes. A veteran in a wheelchair muttered a curse under his breath, his gnarled hands tightening on the armrests. Even children seemed to sense the gravity their fidgeting stilled, their wide eyes fixed on my family as if they had just glimpsed monsters. The applause that had followed earlier honorees had been warm, proud, reverent. Now the only sounds were the hard edges of anger. Soldiers shifted in their seats, shoulders squared, jaws tight. Some turned fully to face my family eyes, sharp with disdain. Others leaned to whisper, but their whispers were not hidden well enough. Traitors. Selling her out. Disgrace. Each word struck me as though it were aimed at my own chest, even though I knew they were not mine to carry. My breath grew shallow. Pain pulsed through my broken arm, but it was nothing compared to the hollow ache spreading through my ribs. This was confirmation of what I had always feared, that my family's cruelty was more than neglect, more than manipulation. It was betrayal at the deepest level, and it had cost lives. For a moment, the ground beneath me seemed to tilt. I saw flashes in my mind. Jackson laughing as we shared rations in the desert, Martinez humming under his breath on patrol, Crawford scribbling notes in a journal he swore would someday become a book. All three of them had died in that ambush, and now I knew why. Because my own blood had given the enemy the map. I swayed, but Hayes's grip tightened. His voice was steady, pitched low enough for me to hear, but strong enough to anchor me. Stand tall, Sergeant. Their shame is not yours. I nodded faintly, though my throat was too tight to speak. My eyes drifted toward the third row. Linda's face was blotched red, her lips moving soundlessly as if rehearsing excuses that would never convince anyone now. My father slumped against the chair back, sweat streaking down his temple eyes, darting like a cornered animal. Kyle stared at the ground, his fingers twitching, stripped of his arrogance at last. The anger of the crowd swelled, filling the air like a storm about to break. I could feel their judgment pressing down, but for the first time in my life, it was not directed at me. It was directed at them. And that shift, though, heavy, lit a fragile ember of strength in my chest. General Hayes let the murmurs run their course before raising one hand, and the crowd fell quiet with military precision. His presence commanded obedience without needing to bark orders. He opened the folder again, his fingers sliding across the pages with deliberate care, as though each sheet were another nail in the coffin of my family's reputation. "The investigation leaves no room for doubt," he said, voice cutting through the humid air. Daniel Monroe accepted repeated deposits totaling over $40,000 in a single year, each aligned with sensitive requests for operational schedules. Linda Monroe coordinated phone calls with individuals tied to known intelligence networks, masking them as interviews for so-called family research. Kyle Monroe provided background information about soldiers stationed here down to the locations of barracks and even details about their daily routines. This was not a misunderstanding. This was systematic cooperation with foreign agents. The collective gasp that followed was sharper than before. People turned fully now, staring at my family with open disgust. My father shook his head violently, rising halfway to his feet. "We didn't know they were enemy agents," he shouted, his voice cracking. "We thought it was legitimate. They paid well, yes, but it was for surveys, for studies." Hayes didn't flinch. He stepped closer to the podium, his eyes narrowing. "Then why did every payment coincide with attacks that cost American lives? Why did each communication conveniently align with requests for details only someone close to a soldier could provide?" He slammed the folder shut with a sound that echoed like a gavel. "Ignorance is not innocence when blood is spilled." The MPs took a step forward, their hands resting on their belts. Linda raised her arms defensively, her pearl necklace catching the sunlight. "We're victims too," she cried, her voice shrill. "They tricked us. We had bills. We needed help. We didn't know." Her plea rang hollow, bouncing against rows of uniformed men and women who had sacrificed far more without ever betraying the flag on their sleeves. I watched from the stage, my body shaking with pain, but also with something fiercer, the realization that the burden of proof no longer rested on my shoulders. For years, my family had painted me as the selfish one, the runaway, the disappointment. Now their deceit was unmasked before the very community I had chosen, and there was no hiding from the weight of that truth. General Hayes's gaze swept the audience one final time. "You came here expecting to watch a medal ceremony," he said, his voice booming. "Instead, you witnessed what betrayal looks like in broad daylight. Let it be known this soldier's courage shines brighter because it was forged in spite of treachery at home. And let it also be known that those who would sell their own blood for money will find no refuge in silence." The applause that rose then was thunderous, not for the medal, not even for me, but for the declaration of justice itself. My stepmother flinched at the sound. My father sank lower in his seat. Kyle buried his face in his hands. The reckoning had come, and it was merciless. The applause still thundered in my ears when the MPs moved decisively toward the third row. The crowd parted slightly, giving them a clear path. My stepmother's face twisted half fury, half panic, as if she could not decide whether to fight or beg. She jerked back in her seat, her pearl necklace trembling against her throat. "This is outrageous!" Linda hissed, her voice shrill. "We're being humiliated in front of everyone. We didn't commit treason. We didn't know." The MPs halted a step away, waiting for Hayes's signal. My father rose clumsily, his hands out as though he could shield himself with empty gestures. His eyes darted to the audience, seeking sympathy. "You don't understand!" he shouted, his voice wobbling with desperation. "We're good people. They told us it was official. They said it was part of some government study. We believed them." But the crowd was not convinced. The faces staring back at him were hard-lined with anger. Veterans muttered curses under their breath. A woman in uniform stood abruptly, her hand trembling as she pointed toward my family. "My husband died in that ambush," she cried, her voice cracking. "You think we care about your excuses?" The ripple of outrage that followed her words was like a second wave of thunder, heavier than the applause had been. Linda tried to rise, but her knees buckled. She clutched the back of the chair as if it could save her from drowning in shame. "It wasn't our fault," she gasped, eyes darting wildly from face to face. "We needed money. We didn't mean for anyone to get hurt." The general's voice cut through cold and deliberate. "3 men are dead because of the information you provided. Others carry wounds that will last a lifetime. Need is not a defense for betrayal." His words struck like hammer blows. Kyle, who had been silent until now, sprang up, his hands trembling. "It wasn't like that," he shouted. "They wanted harmless stuff. Daily routines, family details where soldiers lived, nothing secret. Just background. Everyone exaggerates. You're making it sound worse than it was." The crowd erupted again, a mix of gasps and furious shouts. One older veteran slammed his cane against the ground. Background, he barked, his voice hoarse with rage. "Do you know how many of my friends died because the enemy knew their routines? Nothing is harmless. You might as well have put a gun in their hands yourself." My legs trembled beneath me, the pain in my broken arm radiating through my entire body, but I stood taller in that moment than I ever had before. For the first time in my life, I was not the one being cornered, not the one scrambling to defend myself. The spotlight had shifted. Their lies were unraveling in the open, and the world was finally seeing them as I always had: selfish, reckless, dangerous. I had stood in silence long enough, letting the weight of the general's words crash down on them, letting the crowd's fury expose what I had always known in private. But now the room demanded more, demanded that I speak for myself, and my chest rose with a sharp inhale as I stepped forward despite the pain searing through my broken arm. The microphone still stood at the podium, angled from where Hayes had spoken, and I leaned toward it with steady defiance. "Family doesn't sell out their own blood," I said, my voice carrying across the parade ground with a strength I did not recognize as mine. My words cut clean through the murmur of the crowd, silencing them instantly. Every eye fixed on me. "For years you mocked me, dismissed me, drained me of every dollar and ounce of loyalty I could give, and I let it happen because I believed family meant sacrifice. I believed blood was thicker than water. But what you've done today, what you've done for years behind closed doors, proves something I should have learned long ago. Blood means nothing when loyalty is for sale." Linda's lips parted as if to protest, but I raised my hand and the room stilled again. "You hit me with a chair in front of soldiers, in front of strangers, because you couldn't stand to see me show strength you'll never have. You called it showing off. But let me tell you what showing off looks like. It looks like selling deployment schedules for cash. It looks like buying cars and condos with blood money while soldiers bled on foreign soil. It looks like mocking the Purple Heart as if it's candy while you pocketed the price of my pain." My father tried to cut in his voice. "Ragged Samantha, you don't understand," but I turned on him with a glare that froze him in place. "No, Dad, you don't understand. Soldiers die in wars. You always told me that like it excused everything. But soldiers should never die because their families chose greed over love. That isn't war. That's betrayal." I turned to Kyle, his face pale and twisted, his usual smirk gone. "And you," I said, each word steady, sharp, final. "You called me Soldier Barbie. You laughed at every sacrifice I made. But the truth is, you've been nothing but a parasite feeding on what I earned selling pieces of my life because you thought it didn't matter. You thought you were clever, but today, everyone sees you for what you are. Weak, cowardly, a traitor not just to me, but to this entire country." The crowd stirred low growls of agreement echoing through the rows. Kyle's mouth opened, but no words came. I let the silence hang heavy, suffocating, and then I drew in one last breath. "You wanted to shame me today. You wanted to ruin this ceremony. But the truth is, you only revealed yourselves. I survived an ambush in Kandahar, but the real ambush was this family. And like every ambush I've ever faced, I am still standing while you're the ones going down." The audience erupted, not with polite applause this time, but with raw thunder. The sound of outrage transformed into solidarity, and for the first time in my life, I felt the power of speaking the truth without fear. The echo of the crowd's thunder still rolled across the parade ground when the MPs advanced, their boots pounding in measured rhythm, the kind of sound that carried finality with each step. Linda recoiled, first stumbling back into her seat, her hands clawing at the pearls around her neck, as if they could shield her from justice. "You can't take us!" she shrieked, her voice shrill and frantic. "This is a mistake. We didn't know what we were doing." One MP leaned down, his voice flat but firm. "Ma'am, you need to stand." The steel in his tone left no room for negotiation. My father shoved his chair back violently, the metal legs scraping against the pavement as he surged upright. His hands shot out in wild gestures, his face twisted with panic. "We're not criminals," he bellowed, sweat running down his temples. "We were tricked, manipulated. You can't arrest us for being gullible." The crowd jeered, angry voices rising in unison, and one veteran shouted, "Tell that to the graves at Arlington!" The words cut deeper than any blade, silencing my father mid-protest. Kyle froze his hands, twitching nervously at his sides, his legs refusing to move as if his body had realized what his pride never could. There was no escape from this moment. The MPs spread out, two flanking Linda, one blocking my father's path, another stepping squarely in front of Kyle. Their presence was overwhelming, a wall of discipline and authority that crushed the frantic chaos of my family's protests. Hayes raised his hand, signaling calm, but his eyes stayed locked on them, sharp and unyielding. "You will answer for this," he said, each word slow, deliberate, final. Linda's knees buckled as the MPs grasped her arms and pulled her upright. She struggled, kicking against the pavement, but their grip never faltered. My father attempted to push past his fists, clenching, but the MP's hand caught his wrist and twisted with controlled precision, forcing him down to his knees in a single movement. The audience gasped, then roared with approval. Kyle, seeing his parents restrained, finally broke his voice, cracking as he stammered, "I didn't mean it. I swear it was just for extra cash. I didn't know it would get people killed. Please, you have to believe me." His words spilled like water from a shattered glass, frantic, pitiful, hollow. No one responded. No sympathy came. The MPs closed in around him, snapping restraints over his wrists, and he sagged forward, his head hanging low, the arrogance gone as quickly as it had arrived. I stood, watching my broken arm, throbbing, my body weak, but inside me a strange calm spread. For once, I didn't have to fight alone. The truth was fighting for me. The crowd's anger had become my shield, the MP's authority my sword. My family had ruled my life through fear, manipulation, and violence, but in this moment, their reign crumbled in front of hundreds of witnesses, and the sound of justice was louder than any chair crashing against my bones. The MPs pulled my family to their feet and began to march them toward the edge of the parade ground, and for the first time in my life, I did not feel small in their shadow. I watched Linda stumble, her pearls snapping and scattering across the pavement like pieces of a broken crown, her shrieks growing weaker as the jeers of the crowd drowned her out. My father's shoulders slumped forward, his head bowed, the proud posture he once wore at neighborhood cookouts now reduced to a pathetic shuffle. Kyle's face was pale and wet, his lips trembling as he muttered excuses no one cared to hear. Every step they took away from the stage was another weight lifted from my chest, as if the years of insults, demands, and bruises were being carried out of me alongside them. I had spent my entire life believing their voices were louder than mine, that their control was unshakable. But in this moment, I saw clearly how fragile they had always been. Their power had never come from strength, only from my silence. The crowd's reaction confirmed it. Strangers who had never known me were standing now, clapping not in celebration but in solidarity, their eyes fierce, their voices raised in defiance against the betrayal that had been exposed. Veterans saluted as the MPs passed, not for my family but for the justice unfolding in real time. A woman pressed her hand to her heart, her tears falling freely, and I realized she was not weeping for them. She was weeping for me, for all of us who had endured betrayal and still chosen to stand tall. My arm throbbed in its sling, but inside I felt taller than I ever had before. I thought of my mother gone too soon, who had once held me on her lap near the Charleston shoreline, and whispered that the sea always returned what was taken. Maybe this was the tide she had meant the moment when the cruelty and manipulation that had drowned me for years finally receded, leaving me standing in clear water at last. General Hayes remained beside me, his presence a steady anchor. "Do you see it now, Sergeant?" he asked quietly, his eyes scanning the dispersing crowd. "Their power is gone. It was never real. It only lasted as long as you let them define you." I swallowed hard, my throat tight and knotted. The truth of his words sank deep. For the first time, I wasn't afraid of what would happen when I went home. I wasn't afraid of their anger, their demands, their fists, because home was no longer where they lived. Home was wherever I chose to stand in my own truth. As my family disappeared beyond the gates, swallowed by the convoy waiting to transport them to questioning, I exhaled a breath I had been holding for years. The shift of power was complete, and I knew with absolute certainty that the era of silence had ended. The parade ground settled into a heavy silence after my family was escorted away, the echo of their protests fading into nothingness. I stood at the podium, my arm throbbing, my chest heaving, and for the first time, the eyes of the audience on me did not feel like judgment. They felt like recognition. The master of ceremonies cleared his throat, uncertain whether to continue, but General Hayes placed a hand on the microphone and spoke with calm authority. "The ceremony does not end with betrayal," he said, his voice resonant. "It ends with honor, and it ends with truth. This soldier has faced both enemies abroad and enemies at home, and she has stood her ground through both. That is the measure of courage. That is the meaning of sacrifice." Applause swelled again, deeper and more sustained this time. Not polite clapping, but a roar of solidarity that washed over me like a tide. The sound blurred my vision with tears I had not allowed to fall until now. The medal was placed upon me, its weight pressing against my chest, but instead of feeling like a burden, it felt like armor, a shield forged not only from my service but from my survival. I bowed my head slightly as the general fastened the ribbon, whispering words meant only for me. "You have nothing left to prove. The nation sees you." When I straightened, the crowd rose to its feet, a standing ovation that rattled the rows of chairs and sent the sound of boots stomping into the Carolina sky. For years, I had dreamed of hearing my family's approval, but in that moment, I realized I no longer needed it. The respect of those who understood sacrifice meant more than any hollow words my father or stepmother could ever give. As the band played softly, families leaned in to comfort one another. Soldiers exchanged salutes, and the atmosphere shifted from outrage to solemn unity. Yet even amid the applause and the honor, I felt the weight of what lay ahead. The investigation would not end with today's revelations. There would be trials, testimonies, and headlines in Charleston that would stain the Monroe name for generations. People would whisper, neighbors would gossip, and the family that had once controlled me would be remembered not for what they built, but for what they destroyed. For me, the consequences were different. The military would watch me closely, not with suspicion, but with expectation. They would see if I could carry the weight of being both victim and symbol. I knew promotions might come, opportunities might open, but so too would the shadow of this day follow me wherever I went. Still, as I looked out at the rows of faces filled with respect instead of contempt, I knew I was ready. I had faced the worst kind of betrayal under the brightest light, and I was still standing. The Purple Heart at my chest was more than a medal. It was a promise to myself that the cycle of silence and abuse was broken, and it would never bind me again. The days that followed the ceremony were a blur of hospital visits, press conferences, and official debriefings. My arm was set in a cast, the pain a constant reminder of Linda's outburst, but the deeper ache came from watching the headlines spread across every Charleston paper. Family arrested at Purple Heart ceremony. Fort Bragg, betrayal exposed. My surname, once an anchor that tied me to a toxic household, was now plastered across the news. Yet instead of shame, I felt a strange sense of freedom. The truth was no longer mine alone to carry, it belonged to the world. The investigation moved quickly. Military prosecutors wasted no time assembling charges conspiracy aiding unauthorized intelligence networks fraud. Linda and Daniel were dragged through courtrooms in shackles, their attempts to paint themselves as victims shredded by bank statements and call logs. Kyle, too, found himself cornered, his condo in Charleston seized, his accounts frozen. The smirk that had once seemed permanent on his face was gone, replaced by a hollow stare. Charleston society, the very group Linda had sought to impress by attending my ceremony, turned vicious. Neighbors who once gossiped behind closed doors now whispered openly in grocery store aisles, shaking their heads at the disgrace. Invitations to social clubs vanished. Their names were stripped from church rolls. Even extended relatives distanced themselves, unwilling to be tainted by the scandal. My stepmother's obsession with appearances had collapsed under the weight of her own choices. For my father, the punishment cut even deeper. The construction jobs that came sporadically dried up altogether. No client wanted to hire a man accused of selling out soldiers, no matter how he protested his innocence. Bars that once welcomed him with an open tab turned their backs, unwilling to pour drinks for someone branded a traitor. He called me once, his voice ragged, pleading for help, but I let the call go unanswered. For years, I had been the safety net. Now, the net was gone. Kyle's downfall was public and merciless. His so-called friends abandoned him, unwilling to risk their own reputations. The university revoked his scholarship, citing moral conduct clauses. He was photographed leaving a courtroom in cuffs, his head bowed, the swagger that had defined him evaporated. Online strangers tore him apart, memes mocking his arrogance, veterans groups condemning his betrayal. For someone who thrived on attention, obscurity would have been kinder. Instead, he was immortalized as a cautionary tale. Through it all, I remained silent. I gave no interviews beyond what the Army required. I did not visit the courtroom or attend the hearings. My revenge was not in shouting or gloating. It was in living and standing tall while they crumbled. The smarter path was to let the system, the community, and the truth do the work I had once tried to shoulder alone. And that was exactly what happened. While my family's world collapsed, mine began to shift in ways I never expected. After the ceremony, General Hayes insisted on visiting me at the hospital. He pulled a chair to my bedside, his posture still straight despite his years, his eyes steady in a way that made me feel seen rather than judged. "You've carried more than your share of battles," he said quietly, "but now it's time you learn to lead without carrying everyone else's weight." Those words struck deeper than any lecture or reprimand I had ever received. Over the following weeks, he kept his promise. Hayes arranged for me to shadow senior officers, invited me to meetings that junior soldiers rarely attended, and pressed me to speak, to offer opinions I had once been too timid to voice. He treated me not as a victim of circumstance, but as a soldier forged stronger by surviving it. Slowly, the fear of being dismissed or mocked began to fade. I discovered that when I spoke with conviction, others listened. My peers sought me out for guidance. Younger soldiers gravitated toward me with questions, and for the first time I realized leadership was not about shouting commands, but about steadying others the way Hayes had steadied me. Outside, the Army doors opened too. Veterans groups reached out, asking me to share my story at community events. At first, I hesitated, worried that speaking publicly would feel like reliving the worst day of my life. But Hayes reminded me that telling the truth was not reliving, it was reclaiming. So I spoke. I told audiences not only about the ambush overseas, but about the ambush at home, about the cost of betrayal and the strength of drawing boundaries. I watched as gray-haired men wiped tears from their eyes and women squeezed my hands with trembling gratitude. The more I spoke, the more I realized my pain had been transformed into purpose. Charleston, the city that had once felt like a cage, began to feel different too. Old neighbors stopped me in the street not to gossip, but to thank me. Teachers from my high school sent letters apologizing for never seeing the signs of abuse. Even strangers who had read about the ceremony approached me with respect. Slowly, the identity I had been forced into, the daughter of Daniel and Linda Monroe, was replaced by something new. I was no longer their victim. I was Sergeant Samantha Monroe, a soldier who had survived both battlefields and betrayal and who refused to be defined by either. Under Hayes's mentorship, I was nominated for advanced training with whispers of promotion on the horizon. But more important than rank was the lesson he drilled into me again and again. Your scars are not weakness. They're proof you kept going. And for the first time, I believed him. Several months later, when the trials were behind me and the headlines had faded into history, I found myself walking the quiet rows of Arlington National Cemetery. The crisp autumn air carried the scent of fallen leaves, and the sound of distant traffic was muffled as if the world outside dared not intrude on this hallowed ground. I carried a wreath of white roses in my good arm, the cast long removed though the ache in my bones still flared with the change of weather. Each step felt heavy and reverent as I approached the graves of Jackson Martinez and Crawford, the brothers I had lost in Kandahar, the men whose laughter still echoed in my memory. I knelt slowly, placing the wreath at the center of their stones, my fingers brushing over the carved names. For years I had carried guilt, wondering if there was something more I could have done, some choice I could have made differently, but now I knew the truth. Their deaths were not the result of my failure. They were the result of betrayal far closer to home. And though nothing could bring them back, exposing that betrayal had been a form of justice not only for me, but for them. I whispered their names one by one, promising that I would carry their memory with honor, not with shame. The breeze stirred, lifting the edge of the wreath ribbon, and I felt an unexpected calm settle in my chest, as if the weight of silence I had carried for so long had finally lifted. Standing, I looked across the endless rows of white markers, each one a story, each one a sacrifice. I thought of Hayes's words that scars were proof of survival, and I realized the same was true for cemeteries. They were proof of courage carved in stone. I raised my hand in a slow salute, tears blurring my vision not of despair, but of gratitude. As I lowered my hand, I felt something shift inside me. For the first time, I was not standing as the broken daughter of a toxic family, not even as a soldier seeking approval, but as a woman who had faced betrayal, endured humiliation, and still chosen to rise. Closure did not mean forgetting or forgiving. It meant refusing to be defined by the wounds others had inflicted. It meant reclaiming the story as mine. When I turned to leave Arlington, the flag at the center of the grounds caught my eye, rippling proudly in the breeze. I squared my shoulders, exhaled a steady breath, and walked forward, knowing the past no longer held me prisoner. I was free, and justice, however imperfect, had done its work. When the ceremony ended and the months that followed reshaped the course of my life, I finally understood that justice rarely looks like the tidy stories we grow up believing in. It does not erase the pain or undo the past. Justice is imperfect, complicated, and sometimes unbearably slow. But when it comes, it has a weight that anchors you in truth. For years, I had told myself that family meant unconditional love, that blood was thicker than any wound, but I learned instead that blood without loyalty is nothing more than biology. What makes family is trust, respect, and sacrifice, freely given, not demanded at the end of a threat. That realization was brutal, but it saved me. My stepmother's chair might have shattered bone, but the betrayal beneath it had been trying to shatter my spirit for years. At Fort Bragg, when the truth spilled out before hundreds of witnesses, I saw in real time how masks fall. Linda's manipulations, Daniel's excuses, Kyle's mocking cruelty. They all crumbled under evidence under the gaze of a 3-star general who refused to let their lies stand. That moment broke something in me, but it also rebuilt me. It gave me permission to draw a line, to protect myself, to say no more. I want anyone listening now to remember this: boundaries are not cruelty. They are survival. If someone mocks you, belittles you, or demands loyalty while giving none in return, you have the right to protect your heart. For me, it took a public shaming at a Purple Heart ceremony to finally see it. I hope for you it does not take so much pain. I carried shame for years because I believed I owed my family everything. That was the trap. They wanted my paycheck, my silence, my obedience, but they never wanted me whole. Cutting ties was not abandonment. It was rescue. I rescued myself, and that is something no one can take away. The long-term consequences were clear. My family's name in Charleston became associated with betrayal rather than respect. Neighbors whispered, employers hesitated, even old friends distanced themselves. They had sought money and control, but what they earned was isolation. It hurt to see them fall, but it hurt less than dying in Kandahar would have. Hayes once told me that treason leaves scars deeper than shrapnel, and he was right. My scars ache on cold mornings, but the deeper wounds are invisible. Still, I am proof that healing is possible. It takes time, discipline, and the courage to keep standing when everyone expects you to fall. To my fellow service members, to those who have lived through family betrayal, and even to those who simply carry the weight of silence in your daily life, you are not alone. I share this story not to reopen old wounds, but to remind you that survival is not shameful, it is heroic. Betrayal may cut deep, but resilience runs deeper. The strongest people I know are not those who never fall, but those who rise every time carrying their scars with honor. That is what the Purple Heart on my desk means to me now. Not luck, not pity, but proof of endurance in the face of enemies, both foreign and domestic. If you take nothing else away, let it be. Do not let toxic loyalty destroy you. Blood may call you back, guilt may weigh on you, but your life is worth more than someone else's manipulation. Love is not proven by suffering. Respect is not proven by silence. And family, real family, is the one you build with trust, with honesty, with courage. For me, I found it in my unit in mentors like General Hayes and in the friendships forged through shared service. That was enough. That was everything. So I ask you now, wherever you are watching from, to pause for a moment and think. Have you ever been dismissed, mocked, or even betrayed by the very people who should have lifted you up in your proudest hour? Have you ever drawn a line in the sand and said no more, even when it hurt? Share that story in the comments, because your words might give someone else the strength to choose survival over silence. And if this story struck a chord, tap like, subscribe, and turn on notifications, not for me alone, but because together we can spread stories of resilience, justice, and the power of boundaries. The more voices we raise, the less anyone has to suffer in isolation. Tonight, as I close this chapter, I leave you with the image that carries me forward, a flag rising high against the sky at Arlington, a simple symbol of sacrifice and resilience. That is my truth. That is my justice. And if you have lived through betrayal, if you have survived the worst your own family could do, then you too are proof that survival is extraordinary. Never let anyone diminish that.